Have you ever wondered how you might be able to remember something or associate something with something else? Well, I have, and for that case, I started looking at Mary Whitten Calkins on her work with associations and memory. Mary Whitten Calkins' studies were viewed as primacy, recency, frequency, and vividness, and Calkins was the first APA woman president, and she did most of her research at Wellesley College. Now, she was the one that broke the glass ceiling for women in psychology, basically. She did all of her research, like I said, at Wesley College, and her initial research was found in the first volume of Psychological Review. Calkins had many of her colleagues look down on her when she was doing the studies on associations and memory, but that didn't stop her from achieving what she wanted to achieve. With the findings that she found, that's how we learn now. That's how we look at associations, that's how we look at memory, that's how we even study sometimes. I don't know if you guys have ever thought about it, but I have when I'm studying for a test or something and I look at my notes over and over and over again, and that's what she really studied. Now, Mary Whitten Calkins had a very specific fascination with the development of self-psychology, and she seeked it out as a discipline. Now, how did self-psychology become a prominent study? Calkins was said to have swam against the current with the topic, and many didn't support her stance on self-psychology. During the decades that Calkins became prominent, behaviorism was on the rise. For example, Watsonian behaviorism. And during that time, a psychologist by the name of Samuelson came to the conclusion that the only reason that the shift between topics was happening was because Watson convinced his colleagues that behavior was the only thing that could be studied by observation. In the 1890s to the 1920s, which is when Mary Whitten Calkins was in her prime, Samuelson noticed that psychology started out much or less as the study of consciousness, only to turn into the attempt to explain it away. Because behavior was gaining popularity over human consciousness, it is believed that that is why Calkins was so interested in the topic of self-psychology. When Calkins noticed that self and consciousness were not being studied anymore, she started looking at recent research of what was supposed to have included consciousness. But to her dismay, academic psychologists were arranging their experiments to exclude the sense of self. Calkins' studies came from the fact that behaviorism was becoming more popular as a field of study than the study that is the reasoning for the subject of psychology. Calkins herself admits that self-psychology was not a popular subject by saying the self-psychologist has still to explain the fact that a large number, perhaps a majority of psychologists deny or ignore the self. Calkins had to rival with other systems such as structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, hormic psychology, and gestalt psychology and psychoanalysis. She used the strategies of showing that her studies were just as big as the rival ones in the world of psychology. Calkins and her work ahead of her got to get to work where she needed to be with the research that she wanted to get out there. With the difficulty that Calkins had with self-psychology, she realized that when she was doing her studies on consciousness and associations and memory, that she needed to get it out there right away. Calkins figured out that working with recency, primacy, and frequency and vividness, it brought out different findings. When she studied each of these, she found that frequency had the stronger influence even when repeated multiple times. In the second experiment she did working with these four topics, she looked at auditory effects versus visual presentation. In this, she found that auditory and visual are essentially similar in influence on recency, primacy, frequency, and vividness. So when you're sitting in class and you're just hearing your teacher drone on and on and on, make sure you're listening, because even though she has a PowerPoint up or even though you're taking notes, it's still very valid and very reasonable for you to take in what the teacher is saying. And with these findings, it did bring disappointment to Calkins and her colleagues. So if we're looking towards the future and changes that were brought to the field of psychology, Calkins inspired many people to take a look at the effects of associations, memory, and self-psychology. Even though these were never looked at in her own time as being greater important, we now look at them today to see how we can improve our classrooms and improve how we test students. We can see this in many studies that have come to light. For example, the first one, Howard, Jing, Rao, Koven, and Dady all looked at paired associations. They wanted to test heteroassociative and retrieved context accounts. They looked at single and double functioning pairs and learned that single functioning pairs are learned better than double functioning pairs. When they looked at heteroassociative distinctions, they found that there was a fit for both quantitative and qualitative information in our minds when we associate differences and similarities. With this study, we can see that the work that Calkins did inspired some sense of need of knowledge in the area of associative and how they correlate with memory. Another example that we can look at is the study by Munson and O'Neill, which is a little later than the first one. But it examined the use of nonverbal associations and how they correlate with verbal associations on the memory scale. They used colors and looked at how new associations can be made with those colors and new items that they saw. However, with the first experiment of only looking at nonverbal associations, there was no evidence that there was retrieval of new associations with the colors that were shown. In the second experiment, they used concrete nouns to see the association between nonverbal and verbal uses. They found that these pairings came quicker than when nonverbal associations were only being used. Excuse me. They did more experiments relating to these items being tested, but the two that were talked about relate to what Calkins was trying to accomplish when she looked at associations and memory. These two examples show that Calkins had an impact on how we view associations and memory today. With these two studies, it can be seen that the studies that Calkins introduced to us then are very important to the future of learning and understanding, as I have mentioned before, in complex situations especially. It may not have been seen then as being a good and important study, but we can see today that without the studies that Calkins gave us, there would not be the knowledge of associations and memory that there is today. Today, we talked about Calkins and her rough start with self-psychology, how Watsonian behavior influenced Calkins' research in not looking at behavior but memory. Two different studies that used Calkins' research and the information that Calkins gave us on memory and associations, and how those studies relate to how psychology is today. Without Calkins and the study that she did, we would not have the information about associations and memory that we have today. Are there any questions for me?
Oh, no. Well, there's always
You have a
questions.
question?
There's always questions. The two studies that you cited for the later period, did they directly cite Calkins' research, or was there any connections to Calkins' research?
I didn't find any connections between Calkins' research and them. They didn't actually cite that she was in there, but I kind of made my own associations between the two experiments that they did and how they looked at them and how they studied them, and then I looked at what Calkins studied in her own research, and they kind of related in ways that they did it in functioning and everything.
So would you say that they are missing that connection, and Calkins' research is getting buried, essentially?
I would believe so, yes, 100%. Because the fact that they didn't relate back to Calkins, it kind of shows that they just took it out of their own, but they probably learned about it in some area or some aspect of what she did, so.
Okay.